1.1 Background. If you are kissing your child or wife, say that it is a human being whom you are kissing, for when the wife or child dies, you will not be disturbed. This striking and haunting quote comes from the Enchiridion, a short manual of Stoic ethics, written by Epictetus, an ancient Greek philosopher who started life as a slave and rose to become one of the most respected thinkers in Roman philosophy. It's hard to imagine a more humbling beginning than that, and we should note that on the other side of the spectrum we find the Roman emperor of Marcus Aurelius, who wrote his famed Meditations book, while being in many ways the most powerful man around. Now, a typical reading of this before-mentioned quote might recall the idea of living life to its fullest, and living each day as it truly matters, especially when we realize that something as devastating as losing a child, perhaps the most devastating of all occurrences, is in the realm of possibility. And yet, Epictetus reminds us of the deeply Stoic view that even in this kind of extended grief, as unbearable as it may seem, is nonetheless impermanent and thus temporal. Like everything else in life, it too passes, being under the domain of time, and it is through understanding this notion that we can find a kind of peace and solace amid profound sorrow. But let's take a step back. What actually defines Stoicism as a philosophy? And how does it compare to its cousins in the Hellenistic tradition, Epicureanism, Cynicism, and Skepticism? That's what we'll explore in this video, giving a brief introduction to these major schools of thought that has offered radically different answers to life's big questions. For above all, the main impetus of these schools is how one should live one's life. For those interested, I've also done a few deep dives into Epicureanism in other videos. Anyways, as all things in life, these various schools of philosophy come with historical receipts. Where one of the hallmarks that run through a lot of Hellenistic philosophy is the strong focus on ethics and the big question, how do we live a good and happy life? This also marks a particular contrast as opposed to the working academic philosophers of today, where the emphasis placed on how one should be actively living one's own life is no longer mainstream, where in fact I would claim that this obsession has been left to the field of psychology, as well as to the library halls of self-help books. Of course, even amongst the Hellenistic philosophers, how successful one was at applying the same principle to their own individual life varies a lot between each philosopher. Take for instance the Stoic philosopher Seneca, who very much preached a philosophy of sparse economic living, along with other Stoic virtues. This despite the fact that he was in his own time a very wealthy individual. To quote from the Moral Letters of Lucillius, Letter 2 for instance, Seneca writes that, "The thought for today is one which I discovered in Epicurus, for I am wont to cross over even into the enemy's camp, not as a deserter but as a scout." He says, "Contended poverty is an honorable estate. Indeed, it is to be contended. It is not poverty at all. It is not the man who has too little, but the man who craves more that is poor. What does it matter how much a man has laid up in his safe or in his warehouse, how large are his flocks and how fat his dividends, if he covets his neighbor's property and reckons not his past gains, but his hopes of gains to come? Do you ask what is the proper limit to wealth? It is first to have what is necessary, and second to have what is enough. Farewell." It is clear from the context above that there was a tension in the view of Seneca between the life he lived and the philosophy he preached. Seneca himself tried to navigate through this maze by claiming that his wealth was more the product of inheritance and thus necessity, rather than an explicit devoted love of riches. But this argument does seem rather lacking, does it not? Before we dive into the key philosophies of the various Hellenistic schools, it's worth noting that while these schools are often associated with questions about ethics and the good life, their interests extended well beyond that. They also engage deeply with other branches of philosophy, including metaphysics and logic. Contrary, for instance, to what many associate with the classical logic of the Greeks, there very much exists other traditions as well, such as the pre-classical Indic Vedic philosophy, including the Jnana philosophy, which developed a formal system of logic, and pre-Socratic Greeks, which adhere to some sort of pre-formalized classical logic, or proto-logic if you will. Fast forward to the 19th century, and we see a major transformation in the field with figures such as George Boole and Gottlob Frege, who laid the foundations for modern symbolic logic. Within the Hellenistic context, one particularly interesting development is Stoic logic. Unlike Aristotelian logic, which focuses on terms and their categorical relationships, Stoic logic, on the other hand, placed emphasis on entire propositions. This makes it in turn a sort of early forerunner to what we now know today as propositional logic, which is foundational in any modern logic course. Validity in this logical system is therefore much more concerned with whole statements or propositions and how they are distributed across various premises and their conclusion, rather than doing the same work with terms. We may illustrate this on the classic of a banger of a syllogism associated with Aristotle, namely, number 1, all humans are mortal, the major premise which includes the predicate of the conclusion. Number 2, Socrates is a human, the minor premise here which includes the subject of the conclusion. Number 3, therefore Socrates is mortal, conclusion which connects the minor term and the major term. While for the Stoic propositional logic case, we end up with number 1, if Socrates is human, then Socrates is mortal. Number 2, Socrates is human. Number 3, therefore Socrates is mortal. This syllogism has a slightly different flavor, which I'm sure we all could agree upon, where the focus is shifted from describing relations among terms to describing truth-functional relationships between propositions, meaning we care about evaluating truth functions, where we take as inputs truth values and give unequivocal evaluations in terms of the truthiness or falseness of the given inputs. Notice here also the importance stressed upon truth connectives, which includes terms like if, then, and, or, and not. Now, turning to metaphysics, we can briefly touch upon one of the most enduring questions, namely what truly exists. This line of inquiry has captivated philosophers for centuries, and in many ways it still does today. Interestingly, some of the earliest responses to this question came from the ancient Greek skeptics, who took a rather unique approach. Instead of trying to give a definite answer, they advocated for withholding or suspending belief altogether. This practice is captured by a special Greek term known as epoche, which refers to the suspension of judgment, and it became a central concept for the philosophical movement of the Pyrrhonian Skeptics, a group named after the philosopher of Pyrrho. It was also embraced, though somewhat differently, by the school of academic skeptics, which were linked to Plato's famous academy. The concept of epoche didn't stop in antiquity either. Epoche makes a notable return in more modern continental philosophy, particularly in the movement known as phenomenology. Edmund Husserl, one of the key figures in that tradition, and both a teacher and inspiration for Heidegger, famously or infamously, depending on who you ask, used it as a foundational method for his investigations into consciousness in his own work. To give you a taste about how Pyrrhonian skeptics thought about this concept, here's a quote from Sextus Empiricus, one of the absolute major figures of ancient skeptical philosophy. He writes that epoche is a state of the intellect on account of which we neither deny nor affirm anything. The ancient Greek skeptics would thus come to be associated more so with criticizing metaphysical theories, especially those built upon elaborate assumptions, and by doing so help to expose or pose problems directly concerned with the limitations of human knowledge. A major focus was thus the problem connected with providing epistemic certainty about the real world and how we can make philosophical progress in this regard. This again fostered a strong tradition of skepticism within epistemology, which was most famously taken up later by the French philosopher of Descartes, with his cogito argument, and later with the Scottish philosopher David Hume. To sum up, the skeptics had an enormous influence, not so much with their philosophical propositions or philosophical program in its theory, but rather their utter lack of one. Of course, the downside of remaining in the camp of indifference with regards to knowledge is that this position lends itself open to the criticism that claiming nothing can be known in itself is itself a knowledge claim and therefore needs to be defended. I will leave this topic here, but for those interested, I also have a video on the simulation hypothesis, which discusses skepticism in quite some detail, posing both challenges and strengths to this position. Lastly, we end our background discussion with some historical background, where we note the popularity of Hellenistic philosophy in the Roman world, where Stoic, Epicurean, as well as Skeptic traditions continued to thrive, while the Cynics remained somewhat less popular. To be more specific, the Cynic tradition ended in the 6th century, but many of their rhetorical devices were further taken up by Christians, for example, while the Epicurean, ancient Skeptic, and Stoic traditions also faced stark declines, first with the rise of Neoplatonism as a competitor, then later with the rise of Christianity. The popularity of Hellenistic philosophy in the Roman world may be seen in line with the great emphasis that Romans placed upon duty, honor, as well as self-discipline in both the private and public sector. In addition, the Romans, who are often viewed through a lens of pragmatism, found the less abstract nature of these traditions directly appealing exactly because they focused so much attention on how one should live one's daily lives. It should be noted that the Romans also directly influenced this tradition by both making systematizing efforts into the Greeks' works, as well as make the text become more widely available. On top of this, Roman thinkers such as Cicero, the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, as well as Seneca, helped shape the tradition itself through their own philosophical contributions. In summary, then, we may say that the Roman thinkers helped preserve, popularize, as well as contribute Hellenistic ideas into the ancient world, whereas we move into the early Christianity, there occurs a sharp decline in these philosophies due to their philosophical tensions with the former religion and the canonization of Aristotle, among others, where there develops more of an ideal of bringing in classical Greek thinkers in relation to creating compatibility with Christian ideas and concepts. And as a final note here, let's not forget something fairly obvious, that the knowledge and resources available to ancient thinkers were incredibly limited compared to what we have today, so it's only natural that their worldview included many gaps or ideas that today might strike us as rather strange or even misguided. To quote, Epicurus operated with a highly limited number of elementary principles in nature. He did not know the concept of force, for example, or the associated ideas of attraction and repulsions amongst atoms, not to mention more arcane properties. And for all his efforts to account for all the physical features of the world on the basics of this theory, paradoxes remained. What does shine through, however, is the fact that many of the philosophical questions raised remain pertinent into our own lives, which could not be more true, for instance, when we consider questions such as how one should live one's life, or even questions regarding free will and determinism. But enough of this background, let's move on to introducing the various traditions, shall we? 1.2 Introduction to the various traditions. One should begin here by observing that there was an overarching goal in many ways of Hellenistic philosophy to focus on the goal of what the Greeks called eudaimonia, meaning a state of happiness, which was shared among all the different schools. In addition, the Epicureans and Sceptics focused upon ataraxia, which can be roughly translated into tranquility or peace of mind, along with the Stoics, who emphasized apotheia, meaning freedom from disturbance. Now, both these terms are of course very much related, but what distinguishes them in many ways is the method of achieving these states, for where the Stoics placed the emphasis very much upon virtue and rational understanding, where one should avoid the disruptive nature of passions, the Epicureans and Sceptics tried in turn to tackle much of the effects of fear and belief through their own school of philosophy by becoming less perturbed. However, we should note that on immediate inspection, skepticism seems to be somewhat of an elephant in the room. By that I mean, how can one achieve tranquility, ease of mind, and happiness when the underlying philosophy is devoted to suspending belief about everything? If you are truly committed to not believing anything, then it seems at surface level paradoxical to have a clear belief in a path towards eudaimonia. However, the Pyrrhonian skeptics will argue here that it is because we are so disturbed by beliefs that we are not happy, and that if we only could learn to avoid disturbance altogether in reaffirming the skeptic position of suspending belief, then this is the path forward to not committing to any belief and by extension being free to reach happiness. To quote, that is, skeptics can free themselves from those kinds of turmoil that come with holding beliefs. They cannot free themselves from freezing, thirst, or pain, but they suffer less than others, for they do not add the belief that, for example, pain is bad. The skeptic must explain how, without belief, they can be active. So, as the above quote states, it's really the task of the ancient skeptic to defend the view that a suspension of belief leads to happiness itself, but at the very least here, this given path towards happiness seems compatible in many ways with the philosophy of skeptics. So that's a good start. There is, of course, another can of worms of how they can justify this belief if they suspend judgment on beliefs altogether, but I won't get into this here. Okay, now let's start by giving a short introduction to these mysterious skeptics, shall we? 1.2.1 Skepticism. The ancient skeptic tradition is generally divided into two main branches. The Pyrrhonian tradition, named after Pyrrho, often considered the first true Greek skeptic, and the later academic skeptics, who were associated with Plato's famous academy. I should point out here that it's quite amusing that there would exist a strong movement of skepticism surrounding Plato's academy, when Plato himself very much affirmed a belief in objective truth on different matters, most famously in internal unchanging forms, with perhaps the most prominent example being that of abstract objects. However, on the other hand, Plato was no stranger to critically examining ideas and not taking them for granted, and historically in ancient Greece, it was not uncommon for philosophers who were followers of a tradition to themselves cast doubt or disagree with various philosophies within the tradition. A good example of this is Theophrastus, a student of Aristotle. Despite being one of Aristotle's closest followers, he still found points of disagreement, even during Aristotle's own lifetime. In any case, both the Pyrrhonian and ancient skeptics have undoubtedly shaped the conversation around skepticism. Starting off with the Pyrrhonians, this tradition got its inception with Pyrrho of Elis, who established the radical epistemology of suspending belief, which can be seen in direct contrast with dogmatism, the tendency to lay down principles as undeniably true. We know very little about the life of Pyrrho himself, who did not leave behind any written works, such that the fragments we have compiled came from later sources. It is said that he originally trained as a painter before turning his attention to philosophy. He became a disciple of Anarchus, a philosopher associated with Democritus' Adamism and associated with the court of none other than Alexander the Great. The association with Democritus, atomism must have been influential in terms of turning to skepticism, as Democritus himself was very much a materialist, such that a skeptical attitude towards metaphysics may have been reinforced early on. In addition, Democritus himself challenged sensory perception, as well as reiterating that perspective plays a major role in the construction of both our worldview and understanding. As Pyrrho also traveled with Alexander the Great, it's also highly likely that he would have taken inspiration from Eastern thought, religion, as well as philosophy. Past Pyrrho, we find later philosophers among the Pyrrhonians, such as the doctor and later philosopher Sextus Empiricus, who helped both shape the movement and who focused a lot of attention on discrediting other philosophical positions, as witnessed in the influential work Outlines of Pyrrhonism. This work is also seen as an important historical work, as it compiles and references a lot of now missing historical works. Lastly, in addition to emphasizing the suspension of belief, there was also prescriptions relating to morals to be found in the work, stemming from the fact that if one suspends belief, then one can argue for a plurality or balancing of opinions, where one realizes, for example, how many opinions are given regarding what is beautiful, such that from this alone one should not feel compelled to follow any one definition of beauty. Just as there exists an impossibility of certain knowledge for the skeptics, then likewise it follows that one cannot determine with complete certainty the standards and mode of living. The academic skeptics form another important subset of skepticism in the Hellenistic world, where likewise to the Pyrrhonians, the academics rejected absolute certainty. More specifically, they responded to competing schools of philosophy, such as the Stoics, who held belief in a principle known as cataleptic impressions, which entails that some impressions are true when they are truly confirmed. As an example, there is a parable given by Cicero, in which he relates how the Greek philosopher Zeno would demonstrate catalepsis. To quote, "He would display his hand in front of one with the fingers stretched out and say, 'A visual appearance is like this.' Next he closed his fingers a little and said, 'An act of assent is like this.' Then he pressed his fingers closely together and made a fist, and said that was comprehension. And from this illustration he gave to that process the actual name of catalepsis, which it had not had before. But then he used to apply his left hand to his right hand fist, and squeeze it tightly and forcibly, and then say that such was knowledge, which was within the power of nobody save the wise man." If we take this above hand metaphor from Zeno, which tries to show the progression from appearance to reality, or more importantly, reality as we now know it, then the ancient skeptics are here going to argue that one cannot trust one's sensory perceptions, no matter how convincing they appear to be. Or perhaps to put it in a more colorful manner, just because your hand really feels like it's holding something, does not mean that what you hold is actually real. It could just as easily be smoke in disguise. One of the most prominent philosophers from this philosophic tradition was the philosopher Carneades, who was born in North Africa, but later moved to Athens. Like Pyrrho, he left no writings himself, but nonetheless his ideas were captured by others, which included a strong emphasis not just on the impossibility of certain knowledge, but also on claiming that certainty is always unjustified. Spending much time debating the Stoics, as many skeptics would partake in, he devised a style of argumentation or theory, which is known as probabilism. This theory holds that while certain knowledge is impossible, this does not exclude oneself from acting in a rational manner, in the sense that one can still rely on what is persuasive or epistemically probable as a guide in one's life. This theory then touches directly on the preoccupation of the Hellenistic philosophers, namely how one should best live one's life. This theory was also leveraged against the Stoics and their positive arguments for impressions, as we just touched upon. To quote, "Yet the Academy's arguments against cognitive impressions seem to have shown that no such impressions are to be found. With the aid of his account of probability, Carneades undertook to show that, after all, they are not needed. Rational action and inquiry are possible without the foundation that cognitive impressions promise to provide, because probable impressions can serve in their place. Rational action and inquiry are possible without the foundation that cognitive impressions promise to provide, because probable impressions can serve in their place." To unpack the above quote, Carneades wants us to learn to live well without certainty, and he claims that instead of engaging in the project of providing salvation for certainty of knowledge, one can instead evaluate probable information in order to surpass the justification problem of impressions. This is in fact a rather modern idea found in many scientific circles as well as within the realm of empiricism, where one can accept provisional tentative statements through means of an evaluation process based upon using probabilistic reasoning, where the output is a degree of likelihood instead of certainty. The observant viewer might immediately, for instance, recognize the resemblance to typical Bayesian frameworks and arguments that are very common nowadays. I will not go into a critique of these ideas here, as this is meant as an introduction, but we can certainly say that Carneades influenced philosophy and reasoning among working professionals in a real way from his work for centuries to come. To sum it all up, the ancient skeptical tradition is best known through its two major branches, the Pyrrhonian Skeptics and the later academic Skeptics. What both of these schools had in common was their emphasis on suspending judgment, especially when it came to claims about truth and knowledge. They paid close attention to the subjective nature of perception, recognizing how our senses and interpretations can often mislead us. But skepticism wasn't just an abstract exercise in doubt. As we've seen, it had very practical goal or telos, namely achieving ataraxia, or inner tranquility. The idea that by letting go of the need for certainty, and by refraining from dogmatic beliefs, one could live in a calmer, more peaceful life. In that sense, skepticism wasn't just a way of thinking, it was a real way of living which needed to be practiced. 1.2.2 Epicureanism. Having tackled the skeptics, we now move on to discuss the Epicureans, who in relation to the skeptics can be considered as the most complementary to the former tradition, where the Epicureans were also influenced even more so by the materialist tradition, stemming from Democritus, and despite the fact that they trusted sensory experience more than the former group, they made sure to avoid dogma regarding their beliefs. They also shared the goal of ataraxia, which remained core to their philosophy, where the Epicureans made philosophy practical, where for instance Epicurus purchased a property in Athens known as the Garden, which functioned as a tranquility promoter and source for education within the Epicurean tradition. Although not everyone has come across the term ataraxia, almost everyone is familiar with the term hedonism, of which the Epicureans are strongly associated with. This term has, however, got somewhat of a bad rap when contrasted against the philosophical meaning for the Epicureans, where contrary to popular belief, the Epicureans did not espouse unrestrained carnal pleasure, or more generally unrestrained immediate pleasure. In fact, Epicurus himself warns against overt sexual practice, leading himself a rather ascetic life. Rather, the Epicureans promoted necessary pleasures, where these pleasures should not come in the way of the tranquility of mind, but rather aid them if possible. This may be seen by today's standards in terms of psychological terms, where the personal understanding and evaluation of pleasure leads to a greater personal freedom overall and greater psychological growth. Epicurus himself even goes further in terms of classification and has what can be seen as a hierarchy of pleasures, where he distinguishes between natural and necessary pleasures, such as food and shelter, to natural but unnecessary, such as fine food, and lastly, unnatural and unnecessary, which involves pleasures such as wealth, power, and fame. To conclude, over excessive pleasures were not promoted, as these were considered unnecessary pleasures, which would lead to greater pain, if not in the short run, definitely in the long run. To quote, "When we say then that pleasure is the end and aim, we do not mean the pleasures of the prodigal or the pleasures of sensuality, as we are understood to do by some through ignorance, prejudice, or willful misrepresentation. By pleasure we mean the absence of pain in the body and of trouble in the soul." As is clear from the quote then, although Epicureanism is situated within a hedonistic tradition, it is more accurate to label this tradition as a form of rational hedonism, where the acts of pleasure required careful deliberation and calculation, precisely as to not avoid long-term harm. To be ignorant in this tradition, then, to cultivate pleasures which bring about harm, such as gluttony in food, where a moderation in intake is to be preferred, as although it might bring about immediate pleasure, it will cause harm in the form of indigestion and uneasiness later. Thus, moderation was very often the choice of game of the Epicureans. As a comment, Epicurus himself, it was said, was quite content and even cheerful in his last moments of life, suffering from prolonged suffering due to urinary complications. For him, pain was momentary, and he sought to deal with life's pleasures, even in times of distress. Finally, I should remark here for reference that there did exist a hedonist philosophical tradition, which was known for cultivating immediate pleasures in the ancient Greek world, known as the Cyrenaic school of philosophy. But I will not go into more detail regarding this philosophy here. In addition to pleasure-seeking and the focus on materialism, as espoused by Democritus, which was later developed within the tradition, there was also an epistemological focus among the Epicureans, where this group, in contrast to the Sceptics, affirmed perception as being reliable or in correspondence with the actual world. They did, however, warn against misjudgment when it comes to evaluating knowledge claims, where in parsimony with the later empirical tradition, the Epicureans acknowledged that sensory perceptions might be misconstructed and even act as illusory. To summarize, Epicureanism forms what can be seen as a rational hedonistic tradition, which, like Sceptics, focused upon ataraxia, rejecting supernatural fears, as well as embracing a metaphysical framework of atomistic materialism. This metaphysical framework would also inspire some of the earliest discourses on free will, where amongst others Epicurus advocated for a form of libertarian free will. The Epicureans also shared commonalities with the later empirical tradition, such as focusing upon sensory observation, while at the same time not blindly trusting the senses. This philosophical tradition also had a rich moral philosophy, where friendship was placed highly along with cultivating intellectual discourses in pleasant surroundings, and lastly, not falling victim to pleasures which will provide us with pain in the long run. One should therefore aim to gain freedom from desires and rationalize one's actions in terms of choosing wisely among desires. Lastly, as we have not explored in detail here, the Epicureans warned against seeking political ambition, where Epicurus himself can be seen as distancing himself from the political world in an act of political quietism, if you will. Instead, he advocates for seeking personal peace and tranquility in a tranquil space, which can be seen in relation to his own garden, where followers were free to contemplate and take part in their pleasures unperturbed. 1.2.3 The Cynics. By far the least famous Hellenistic tradition that we will cover in this video, which sees a philosophical tradition concerned with an anomic breakdown of mainstream societal values, where what is favored is in its replacement a life of virtuous self-sufficiency, asceticism along with both questioning and breaking of societal norms. Just how far to extremes this tradition was willing to take things can be seen in the life of Diogenes, the perhaps most famous proponent of this tradition, who himself confined himself to such asceticism that it is said that he lived in a bathtub, disavowing all but the most essential needs. However, it would be a mistake to simply gloss over this tradition, as it inhabits many interesting philosophical ideas and a quality of ideas which were in many ways ahead of their time, such as the rejection of patriotism. Now, granted, this was long before the establishment of a nation-state, but the Greeks had their own form of patriotism in regards to living in their differing city-states, known as polis, with examples including Athens, Syracuse, or Thebes, for example. Diogenes' rejection of patriotism can be seen as being cosmopolitan, taken to relate to a sort of global citizenship. To quote, asked where he came from, Diogenes of Sinope said, "I am a citizen of the world." In this last quote, Diogenes is responding to a question, calling for him to state his origin with what seems to be a neologism. To be a polites is to belong to a polis, to be a member of a specific society, with all of the benefits and commitments such memberships entails. By not responding with the expected synop, Diogenes is renouncing his duty to Sinopeans as well as his right to be aided by them. So as we see from this quote, Diogenes placed emphasis on a shared commonality amongst all citizens, where there was a radical rejection of conventional Greek notions of polis-based identity, here referring to city-states, patriotism, and social hierarchy. It's apparent that the Cynics can be seen in relation to rejecting societal conformity and embracing a sort of creative freedom, which we might in modern contexts associate with anything from the freedom to choose what to wear to not striving to established trends. Lastly, the focus on leading a simple life may be seen in conjunction with various religious traditions such as Christianity, where the figure of Jesus Christ also led a simple life, which was later emphasized in Christian traditions such as the Franciscan order established by Saint Francis of Assisi and the Quakers. But let us here get back to focusing on the life of Diogenes. For while the first philosopher to outline the ideas of the Cynics was Antisthenes, who himself was a pupil of Socrates in the late 400 BCs, and can be seen as the founder of this tradition, the prototypical philosopher of the Cynics is absolutely Diogenes. The ancestry to classical philosophy in terms of Socrates is not lost upon Diogenes either, as he himself was concerned with investigating the virtuous life, and in terms of epistemology rejected vast metaphysical theoretical systems which have been associated with philosophers such as Plato, for instance. He himself chose to ground knowledge in action and perception and not in theory. This latter point can be seen in commonality with Socrates' overall Socratic tradition of asking skeptical questions of inquiry. One could even say that while not as extreme as Diogenes, Socrates also challenged societal conventions in his own day and refused to conform in many instances to society, leading eventually to his own death penalty. And just like Diogenes, Socrates would himself employ humor as well as provocation when making argument. Let's circle back to the origins of the Cynic tradition. The very name Cynic comes from the Greek word kynikos, meaning dog-like, a nickname famously given to Diogenes. At first this might sound rather crude, but we have to remember that this was a philosopher who went to extreme lengths in order to provoke as well as reject human standards of decency, while at the same time praising the virtue of dogs and admonishing societal conformity. Perhaps my favorite story regarding Diogenes is the story of him walking around with a lantern in mid-daylight. Whereas people would ask him why he was carrying around a lantern in daylight, he would then remark that he was in search of an honest man. However, the most famous story relates a so-called incident in which Alexander the Great visited Diogenes, where upon offering him a favor, Diogenes replied that, "Stand a little out of my sun." Alexander walked away, laughing, and told his followers, "If I were not Alexander, I would be Diogenes." Thus, we may argue here that there was a well thought out philosophical justification for behaving the way Diogenes did if we view the principles behind the philosophy, which argued for a living a natural life, meaning rejecting societal standards such as authority in order to live in accordance with one's natural reason. The pursuit of happiness or eudaimonia was therefore achieved by living in accord with nature, as understood by human reason. We might also make a connection here between the dismissal of authority and the later developed political ideology of anarchism, which shared a rejection of hierarchies and unjustified authority. The view of cosmopolitanism discussed earlier is also very much in line with the anarchist conception of a world with no borders or nations in the future. But there are also stark differences in the sense that Diogenes does not have a systematic structural political program he wants to implement. And finally, to wrap up our discussion on Diogenes, it's worth emphasizing that, much like Socrates, Diogenes believed that philosophy wasn't just something you talked about, it was something you lived. For him, actions spoke louder than words. His entire life was also a kind of performance, a living example of the values he preached under Cynic philosophy. Following Diogenes, there are a number of philosophers in this tradition, ranging from Crate of Thebes to Demoniacs, where above all applied ethics were a keen focus as shared by all major Hellenistic philosophical traditions. One might consider the fact that this tradition lacked in popularity and continues to do so in current times precisely as it is regarding as too extreme. But another vantage point to take is that one could view the extremeness in terms of an anti-intellectual flavor that is used for effect in order to motivate a strong reaction amongst its non-followers. Another point is that the anti-theoretical approach espoused by this group makes it difficult to label as a philosophical school as such, and this may have played a role in the sense that it made organizing and the spreading of philosophy more difficult than in other schools and traditions. To summarize, the Cynics were very much about smashing societal conventions and norms through their radical philosophical program, which was composed of strong elements of asceticism, opposition to superstitious thinking, as well as weighing the importance of the individual. Although they were very much concerned with ethics in daily life, their systematic rejection of large-scale metaphysics can be seen as a metaphysical view in its own sense, characterized by a sort of minimalism in which the Platonic notion of an immortal soul was rejected. There is also a certain flavor of pragmatism to this group, as human individual behavior becomes the focus, where one derives conclusions using sensory perceptions and not according to theoretical ponderings from the philosopher's chair. 1.2.4 The Stoics. Last but not least, we move to the Stoics, the most famous of the group, and a philosophical tradition which continues to permeate both social media, and self-help books. Our modern use of the word Stoic to describe someone who is calm, rational, and emotionally steady isn't far off from the original philosophy. Traits like bravery, self-control, reason, and emotional resilience are all central pillars of Stoic thought. The word itself makes reference to a columnade located in Agora, Athens, the very place that its founder Zeno of Citium met along with other followers. Zeno, who originally came from Cyprus, it is said studied Platonism under Xenocrate and Polemo before later beginning teaching himself, and would throughout his life gain a number of followers as well as respectability and fame. Zeno weighed virtue as the sole good in his teachings, arguing that Stoic temperaments such as wisdom, courage, and justice should be focused upon, whereas external things such as wealth and fame were neutral before an evaluation in terms of virtue has also been made. That is, these things might not be bad in themselves if considered in the right virtuous framework, or more importantly, acted upon in a virtuous manner. In commonality with Diogenes, he viewed the citizen in cosmopolitan terms in a certain sense, in that he envisioned a human community where people are bound by reason and would not succumb to destructive emotions. However, there is also a certain tension in this view, as he valued his patriotic heritage from Cyprus to such a degree that when offered citizenship to Athens, he declined, stating reasons of being perceived as unfaithful to his homeland. Lastly, he espoused living in harmony with nature, where nature was for Zeno governed by logos, a term which has frequently been hard to translate, and which is used in a variety of contexts, such as by the early church fathers, for instance. For Zeno's case, we might translate this into meaning rational principles which govern the universe. To quote, "Like the Cynics, Zeno recognized a single soul and simple good, which is the only goal to strive for. Happiness is a good flow of life," said Zeno, and this can only be achieved through the use of right reason coinciding with the universal reason, logos, which governs everything. A bad feeling, pathos, is a disturbance of the mind, repugnant to reason and against nature. The consistency of soul, out of which morally good actions spring, is virtue. True good can only consist in virtue. Thus, as is evident from the above passage, Zeno placed major emphasis on rationality, as this trait was fundamental in order to live in harmony with the universe. Therefore, just as the universe is abiding by rational laws, or to state it like Zeno, that the universe is governed by logos, a rational guiding principle that structures the very foundations of reality itself, then to act with accordance with rationality is to act with accordance with logos. The influence on reason on argumentation was also clearly evidenced by the fact that Zeno would often employ reasoning techniques as tools which would challenge the interlocutor. The most famous of these include posing paradoxes, which have also served as important in mathematics, with a special emphasis on the paradoxes which relates to motion in particular. To conclude, Zeno was a major contributor to Stoic philosophy, and besides his philosophy of morals, he also made contribution to other areas of philosophy, such as epistemology and metaphysics. As historically, Stoicism saw a great popularity in ancient times before declining in the early Middle Ages, it is no surprise that we find many other Stoic philosophers than Zeno. Some other notable names include Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius, as we have mentioned in the introduction, but we also have figures such as Chrysippus, who overtook the mantle from Zeno and is particularly known for his treatment on logic. To summarize, Stoicism is a philosophy very much concerned with the teaching of Stoic principles, such as courage, wisdom, and justice, among others, and weighted misfortune and suffering not in terms of the event themselves, but rather how we made judgments about these events. For the Stoics, it followed that one should, through careful rational consideration and reflection, evaluate these circumstances of suffering in order to pay close attention to what can be meaningfully done to affect the situation. That is, we should only focus upon that which we can control. We have also seen that while Stoicism focuses much attention on how we should live our lives, it has also important things to say about logic, metaphysics, and epistemology, as well as the fact that due to its popularity, it affected many people, which again gave rise to large works of philosophical treatments. 1.3.1 Contrasting the various philosophical traditions. Having given an introduction to the various traditions, I want to end this video discussing some figures which connect differences and similarities between the differing traditions. I feel these can function as a quick aid in terms of distilling down the most important concepts from the various traditions. The first table relates a particularly Stoic question, relating if virtue is the only true good. But more importantly, we have the responses from the various traditions, given their take on this question. I have not touched upon peripatetic philosophy as it relates to Aristotle in this video, who is very much a classical philosopher. But this tradition in the context of the figure is affirming that virtue is the only good, but that other things are both desirable and necessary. In fact, Aristotle goes further than this, claiming that in contrast to the Stoics, virtue is not enough for happiness, but that one also needs external goods. For the second table, it goes through the timeline for various Stoic philosophers, where we should pay special attention to Stoicism creeping up in the Roman worlds as time progresses. The Romans themselves were of course very much inspired by the ancient Greeks, but were also more pragmatically concerned in many ways, which explains in part why Stoic philosophy became so popular among the Romans. The next table exemplifies the various philosophies through a sequence of humorous cartoons, where I really like the Epicurean square located in the bottom right, which exemplifies the great deal of pleasure one can find in a single pool of water. The next table shows a timeline of both the Stoics and the Epicureans, where we should be careful not to confuse the Diogenes of Oenonanda with the Diogenes we looked at in the tradition of the Cynics. Lastly, we have a table looking at some notable philosophers, which extends more globally in terms of output, including religious figures such as the Buddha and Lao Tzu, where it is of course very much debated if Lao Tzu actually existed. I believe Confucian, in terms of existence, is better corroborated if I'm not mistaken. In any case, we do witness our skeptic friend Pyrrho making an entrance here in this diagram, so pay attention to that, along with the other philosophers and thinkers. Okay, that sums up this introduction to largely Hellenistic philosophy, with some exceptions creeping up in the Roman world concerning the philosophical traditions of Epicureanism, Stoicism, Skepticism, and the Cynics. Lastly, regarding sources for this video, I have left them in the description. Among others, I have listed a very short work of Epictetus, which you can read through in a couple of hours and give some good framework for Stoicism. I'm also currently reading Stoics, Epicureans, and Sceptics by R.W. Sharples, which is again a shorter read and might be something to pick up if you want an overview of the most important concepts of the differing schools. As a last recommendation in terms of sources, I would recommend the entry at the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on Skepticism, which goes through a lot of different materials, which I found helpful when making this video. Also, the same entry on Epicureanism is very excellent as well. Okay, that sums up this video. For in the future, I'll probably make more detailed video on each separate tradition, so that should be something that gives even more detail to the various traditions. Okay, cheers!